Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You sent us this fascinating piece called Texto Colado. It's all about, making the most of life after 60, finding real happiness and getting rid of unnecessary worry. So that's what we're going to deep dive into today. It really gets into some specific attitudes that this text suggests we're better off leaving behind if we want to live a balanced, peaceful, and meaningful life as we get older.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that struck me is just how many different areas it covers. Everything from finances to relationships to taking care of your health. It's like it takes a really holistic view of well-being, specifically for this time in our lives.
It does. And, it kind of makes you think, right? Like, have you ever really stopped to think about, like, those little habits, those almost like automatic ways of thinking that might actually be holding us back from being truly happy and healthy as we move into this next chapter?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so the first one we're going to tackle is being excessively generous. Now, of course, generosity is generally seen as a good thing. I mean, it's a quality that most people admire, right?
Oh, definitely. It's something that can really enrich both the person giving and the person receiving. But the text makes a really good point about balance, especially as we get past 60. It's not about shutting ourselves off from others, not at all. But it's about recognizing that there can be, too much of a good thing, and that can have, some unintended consequences.
Exactly. It talks about how, even well-intentioned generosity can actually turn into, stress and emotional fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And it can put a strain on our finances, too. The text describes people feeling obligated to constantly help others, whether it's their kids, grandkids, friends, and sometimes they're doing it with money they can't afford to give or time they don't really have, or they're taking on responsibilities that, maybe aren't really theirs to take on.
Yeah, and the examples it gives are so relatable, Things like lending money without any clear agreement on how it'll be paid back, or always feeling like you have to rescue people from their own messes, or always putting everyone else's needs ahead of your own. It's like when we think about the realities of aging, we have to realize that, our resources, whether it's our physical energy or our financial security, they often become more limited and precious.
That's a really good point. And I love that the text actually encourages us to ask ourselves some really direct questions before jumping in to help. Like, is this really my responsibility? And am I in a position to offer help without putting my own well-being at risk?
Yeah.
Taking that pause before acting, I think, is so valuable.
It really is. And it ties in with the idea of setting boundaries, which is, a big theme in this section. The text doesn't shy away from the fact that, unfortunately, some people might try to take advantage of older adults. So learning to say no politely and without feeling guilty, it's not selfish. It's actually a really important way of protecting ourselves.
Makes sense. As the text says, when we're in a good place ourselves, physically, emotionally, and financially secure, we're actually in a much better position to offer meaningful help to others when it's truly needed.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to the second attitude the text talks about, which is having naive optimism. Now, I think it's important to say that having a positive outlook on life, that's a good thing.
Oh,
right?
yeah, definitely. That ability to see the glass half full can be so helpful in dealing with, life's ups and downs.
Right. But the text points out that there's a potential downside when that optimism becomes a little too trusting, a little too unquestioning.
And it's interesting how the text talks about how, that kind of blind optimism can actually make us more vulnerable to disappointment, frustration, and even, to being taken advantage of.
Yeah, like those too good to be true investment opportunities that prey on people's hope for a quick return, or those requests for money from strangers who, might not have the best intentions, or just generally, being too trusting of people we don't really know.
It's like, there's sometimes this idea that older adults are more trusting, and unfortunately there are people who might try to exploit that. So it's really important to make that distinction between, healthy optimism, keeping a positive spirit, and just ignoring, obvious red flags. The text calls it intelligent optimism.
Intelligent optimism. I like that. So what does that actually look like?
Well, I think it's about finding that balance between hope and prudence, So keeping that hopeful outlook, but also, asking questions, evaluating situations, trusting your gut feeling when something doesn't feel right.
Yeah, so not denying reality or making, impulsive decisions based on wishful thinking. Being positive doesn't mean we have to, stop thinking critically. Okay, so next up, socializing with negative people. I think this is something we all have to deal with at some point, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But the text makes a really interesting point about how this becomes even more important to pay attention to as we get older.
What's fascinating is that it really shifts the focus from quantity to quality when it comes to our relationships. As we age, our time and energy become even more valuable, so we really have to think about, where and with whom we're investing them.
That's a good point. And the text gives some pretty vivid descriptions of the types of negative people we might encounter. The constant complainers, those who always seem to focus on the bad, the gossipers, the energy vampires who just leave you feeling drained after spending time with them. I'm sure we've all met people like that at some point, right?
Oh, definitely. And it goes beyond just feeling, a bit down or annoyed after seeing them. The text talks about some pretty serious consequences for both our mental and physical health. Like studies have shown that constant exposure to negativity can increase our cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone. And that can increase the risk of heart problems. It's also been linked to depression, so it's not just a minor thing.
Wow. So really being mindful of who we spend our time with becomes even more important as we get older.
Absolutely. And it's important to distinguish between, being there for a friend who's going through a rough patch, which is part of any healthy relationship, and surrounding ourselves with people who are just, chronically negative about everything.
Right.
So the text suggests, paying attention to how you feel after spending time with someone. If you consistently feel exhausted or demotivated or even sad, well, that's a pretty clear sign.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, the text encourages us to seek out relationships that bring joy and lightness into our lives, relationships that are mutually supportive and encouraging.
Absolutely. I mean, this stage of life should be about enjoying those connections that really uplift us and make us feel good.
Okay, so let's move on to another important topic,
Yeah.
Which is forgetting to save. The text really stresses how crucial financial security is after 60.
Yeah, and it challenges this myth that, once you reach a certain age, financial planning is no longer important. In reality, it might even become more important, especially considering that for many people, their income might decrease after retirement. And at the same time, expenses, especially healthcare costs, often go up. So having that solid financial foundation is absolutely essential.
Right. It's not like you suddenly don't need to worry about money anymore just because you're older.
Mhm.
And the text really emphasizes the importance of having an emergency fund and being mindful of our spending habits.
Yeah, and it gives some really practical tips too, like regularly reviewing your expenses to see where you can cut back without affecting your quality of life, negotiating for better rates on services, looking for senior discounts, and even, exploring ways to generate some income during retirement, if that's something you're interested in.
And it also warns against taking on unnecessary debt, especially those long-term payment plans that can become a real burden when you're on a fixed income.
Exactly, because ultimately, financial security in later life is about peace of mind. It's about having that sense of independence and control over your own life, knowing that you can handle unexpected expenses without having to rely on others.
Okay, so now let's talk about another area that's crucial for a happy and worry-free life after 60, neglecting our health. The text emphasizes that our health often becomes an even bigger priority as we age.
And one thing I really appreciate is how it challenges this idea that constant pain and limited mobility are just inevitable parts of getting older. It acknowledges that some physical changes are natural, of course, but it really stresses that taking care of ourselves can make a huge difference in our quality of life.
It talks about how, good health impacts so many things.
Yeah.
Our ability to do the things we enjoy, preventing or managing chronic illnesses, our energy levels for socializing, even our independence.
Yeah.
And it gives some specific advice on what we can do.
Right. Like it really emphasizes the importance of a balanced diet. And I like that it's not vague about it. It gives concrete examples like reducing sugar, saturated fats, processed foods, and focusing on fruits, vegetables, lean protein, fiber. It's all about making healthier choices.
And it also talks about exercise, right?
Right.
Like even if we have to adapt our activities to our physical abilities, there are still things we can do to stay active.
Exactly. Walking, stretching, water aerobics, even weight training that's adapted for our needs. All of these can help prevent pain, keep our bones strong, improve our posture, and you know what? Reduce the risk of falls.
And of course, the text also highlights the importance of regular medical checkups.
Mhm.
Early detection is so important, and it can make a real difference in the long run.
Absolutely. And it also addresses mental health, which is, just as important as physical health. Staying socially connected, engaging in hobbies, finding things that bring us joy, and addressing stress and loneliness, it's all part of the picture.
So it's a very holistic view, reminding us that taking care of our health after 60 isn't just about, avoiding illness. It's about living these years with energy and vitality.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about family. The text acknowledges that family is often our primary support network, especially as we age, but it also dives into the potential for conflict.
Yeah, and it emphasizes the importance of approaching those relationships with extra care, especially after 60. Sometimes being closer to family or relying on them more can actually create more opportunities for friction if we're not careful.
Right, so patience and mutual respect become even more important. And the text emphasizes that avoiding conflict isn't just about, keeping the peace on the surface. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels supported and understood.
And, it points out how often small disagreements can escalate into big fights because of misunderstandings or poor communication. So the advice to communicate clearly, honestly, and respectfully without blaming each other, that's so important for preventing those small issues from turning into major conflicts.
Yeah. The text also talks about managing expectations, especially when it comes to our grown children and grandchildren. Understanding that they have their own lives and their own challenges, and being flexible about how we connect with them.
Right. It's about recognizing that their lives are different from ours, and that's okay.
And it talks about those shifts in family roles that can happen as we get older. Adult children might start taking on more caregiving responsibilities for their parents. So open communication, setting boundaries, and adapting to those changes are really important for everyone to get along.
And it encourages us to nurture those intergenerational connections, with empathy and respect for each other's perspectives.
Okay, so now let's delve into a specific aspect of family dynamics. Worrying excessively about grandchildren. Of course, the text acknowledges the immense joy that grandchildren can bring.
Oh, for sure. They're a source of so much happiness and, they connect us to the future. But the text makes this really interesting point about the potential downsides of overprotection and excessive worry.
Yeah. It talks about how that constant worrying about our grandchildren can actually affect our own health and well-being, both emotionally and physically. It's natural to want the best for them and to be concerned about their safety. But the text cautions against taking on too much anxiety and responsibility for their lives.
And it explains how, trying to protect them from everything can actually be harmful in the long run. Like if we always step in to solve their problems or shield them from every challenge, we might actually be preventing them from developing resilience and coping skills, the skills they need to navigate the world on their own.
That's so true. And the text also emphasizes the importance of us as grandparents, maintaining our own lives, our interests, our own well-being.
Yeah.
If we focus all our energy on our grandchildren's every move, we can easily neglect ourselves, and that's not good for anyone.
And it warns against creating a dynamic where, our grandchildren become dependent on us to solve all their problems. It's about encouraging their independence and, realizing that our role is to offer support and guidance, not to constantly intervene.
So it's about finding that balance.
Right.
Being there for them, offering love and wisdom, but also giving them the space to learn and grow on their own. Okay, and finally, the last attitude the text talks about is annulling yourself for others. I think this is something many of us can relate to, especially as we get older and maybe take on more caregiving roles.
Yeah, it's this tendency to constantly put everyone else's needs ahead of our own to the point where we end up neglecting our own desires and well-being. And the text is really clear about how damaging this can be in the long run.
It talks about how this pattern of self-neglect can lead to a lot of negative emotions like frustration, fatigue, resentment, and even a loss of our own sense of identity.
Exactly.
And it reminds us that taking care of ourselves is not selfish. It's actually essential for our own happiness and for the well-being of those around us. We can't really show up for others if we're running on empty ourselves.
That's a really important point.
And the text encourages us to make time for our own passions, to pursue things that bring us joy, and to set boundaries without feeling guilty.
Because our lives have value too,
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we deserve to be a priority in our own lives.
Exactly. So looking back at everything we've discussed today, this deep dive into Texto Colado has shown us that living a fulfilling life after 60 isn't just about avoiding major problems. It's also about being aware of these more subtle attitudes and making choices that support our well-being.
It's about taking a proactive approach and realizing that This phase of life isn't just about decline or limitations. It's actually full of potential for growth, for freedom, for new experiences.
So this leads to a final question for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, what's one small change you could make in your own life to embrace this chapter and cultivate more happiness and well-being in the years ahead?
No matter our age, we all have the power to shape our future through the choices we make each day.
That's a really empowering thought.
It is.